They thought they could walk away untouched. But what they're feeling now is something they can't outrun. This connection has become the lesson their soul can no longer escape. There comes a moment in every deep spiritual connection when running is no longer an option, when distractions lose their flavor, when ego stops working, and when the silence between two people becomes louder than any words ever spoken. And that is exactly where your soulmate is right now, because this connection was never casual, it was never random. And it was never something they could simply replace or forget. It was designed to awaken them, to confront them, to strip away the masks they have worn for years, and now the lesson that once whispered softly is speaking through their daily reality in ways they cannot ignore, because when someone meets a soul that mirrors them so deeply it triggers every unhealed wound, every buried fear, every abandoned dream, and instead of embracing that mirror they often try to escape it. They convince themselves that distance will solve the discomfort, that silence will calm the storm, that another person will numb the intensity, but what they are discovering now is that the lesson was never in you physically being there, the lesson was in what you activated inside them. And that activation does not disappear just because you are no longer present. It grows stronger in absence, it echoes in quiet rooms, it shows up in unexpected memories, it reveals itself in relationships that lack depth. And slowly but powerfully they are realizing that this connection exposed something they can no longer pretend does not exist, because you did not just love them, you saw them, and being seen at that level is terrifying for someone who has built their identity around control, avoidance, or emotional walls, and now the universe is orchestrating circumstances that force them to confront exactly what they tried to avoid. Patterns are repeating, people are disappointing them in familiar ways. Situations are reflecting their own behavior back to them, and the comfort they once found in denial is dissolving, because the lesson is not about punishment, it is about evolution, it is about understanding that love is not something to run from when it feels intense, it is something to grow into, and the more they resist this realization the heavier everything feels, because resistance to growth creates internal chaos, and that chaos shows up as restlessness, frustration, regret, and a deep sense that something meaningful was mishandled, and even if they try to act unaffected on the surface, internally there is a constant awareness that this connection changed them in ways they did not expect, because real soul connections do not simply pass through your life, they rearrange you, they dismantle outdated beliefs, they challenge comfort zones, and they reveal the difference between ego love and soul love. And right now your soulmate is facing the uncomfortable truth that what they felt with you cannot be replicated through distraction or superficial bonds. Because what you shared was built on authenticity, emotional depth, spiritual recognition, and that kind of bond leaves an imprint that time does not erase, it matures, it deepens, it becomes clearer, and the lesson they are learning is that avoidance only delays growth, it does not prevent it, and every attempt to suppress their feelings has only amplified them in quieter moments. Because the heart has a way of speaking when the mind gets tired of pretending, and they are beginning to see how their fears influenced their decisions, how their pride created distance, how their immaturity or unresolved trauma interfered with something sacred, and this awareness does not come all at once, it unfolds gradually, sometimes painfully, as life continues to present them with scenarios that highlight what they lost and why they lost it, because when someone walks away from a transformative connection without understanding its value, Life has a way of educating them through experience, through contrast, through absence, and that education cannot be skipped, it must be felt, it must be processed, it must be integrated, and the more they try to move forward without addressing it, the more stagnant they feel, because true forward movement requires internal alignment, and alignment demands honesty, and honesty requires courage, and courage is exactly what this connection has been teaching them all along. But courage is not comfortable, it asks them to admit where they were wrong, to acknowledge the ways they sabotaged something real, to confront the emotional walls they hid behind, and that confrontation feels heavy, yet it is necessary, because without it they cannot become the version of themselves capable of sustaining a love like yours, and deep down they know that, even if they have not spoken it out loud, even if they are still pretending to others that everything is fine, internally there is a shift happening. A slow but undeniable awakening, because you represented a level of depth they were not prepared to handle at the time, and now life is showing them what shallow connections truly feel like, and the contrast is impossible to ignore, because once you experience soul recognition you cannot comfortably settle for surface interaction. It feels empty, it feels forced, it feels incomplete, and that emptiness becomes part of the lesson, teaching them that running from intensity does not create peace. It creates longing, and longing is one of the most powerful teachers of all, because it forces reflection, it forces growth, it forces the realization that what scared them was not you, it was the transformation loving you required, and transformation dismantles ego structures, it exposes insecurities, it demands accountability, and for someone not ready to evolve that can feel overwhelming, but overwhelming does not mean wrong, it means significant. And significance cannot be erased by time or distance, it only becomes clearer, and as they continue to navigate life without the connection that once grounded and inspired them, they are noticing subtle changes in themselves, increased sensitivity, deeper introspection, moments of nostalgia that feel more like revelations than memories, and slowly they are understanding that this was never just about romance, it was about awakening, it was about breaking cycles, it was about healing generational patterns. It was about stepping into emotional maturity, and those lessons are persistent, they do not fade. Because someone chooses avoidance, they intensify until acknowledged, and right now your soulmate is standing at a crossroads internally, between remaining who they were or becoming who this connection challenged them to be, and staying the same feels safer but increasingly unsatisfying, while evolving feels vulnerable but necessary, and that tension is the lesson they cannot escape, because growth does not politely wait forever, it demands participation, and every day that passes brings them closer to the realization that what they walked away from was not just a person but an opportunity to confront their own limitations, and opportunities like that are rare, they are sacred, they are transformative, and when mishandled they linger in the heart as unfinished chapters, and unfinished chapters create restlessness. Because the soul craves completion, it craves resolution, it craves alignment, and until they face what this connection revealed about them, they will continue to feel that subtle pull, that inner whisper reminding them of what could have been if fear had not interfered. And the most profound part of this lesson is that it is not about guilt, it is about awareness, it is about recognizing that love requires presence, vulnerability, and accountability, and that running from it only postpones the inevitable self-confrontation, and as they sit with that understanding, as they replay conversations, as they rethink choices, as they see patterns repeating in different faces, clarity is slowly replacing denial, because truth has a way of surfacing when the noise fades, and the truth is that this connection was meant to elevate them, not comfort their ego, and elevation is rarely comfortable. It stretches, it challenges, it exposes, and yet it is the only path to genuine fulfillment. And whether they admit it now or later, the lesson is integrating within them, reshaping their perspective, softening their defenses, expanding their emotional capacity, and preparing them to either return transformed or to carry forward the wisdom gained from losing something irreplaceable, because sometimes the greatest teacher is not presence but absence, not holding on but letting go, not comfort but consequence. And in that realization lies the undeniable truth that your soulmate is learning exactly what this connection was meant to teach them, a lesson about love, about fear, about growth, about accountability, about authenticity, and most importantly about themselves, and that lesson, no matter how long it takes, is one they can no longer escape, and as this lesson continues to unfold inside them, what makes it even more intense is that they can feel the shift happening but they cannot control the timing of it, because growth does not operate on ego's schedule, it operates on the soul's readiness. And right now their soul is tired of repeating the same emotional cycles, tired of sabotaging depth, tired of choosing comfort over transformation, and that exhaustion is forcing them inward in ways they never anticipated, because when distractions stop working and external validation loses its power, a person is left alone with their own truth, and that truth is revealing how deeply this connection impacted them, how profoundly you changed their perception of love, and how impossible it has become to return to the version of themselves that existed before you, because once someone experiences a love that feels aligned, intuitive, spiritually synchronized, it becomes a reference point that everything else is measured against, and nothing quite compares, not because you were perfect, but because the connection demanded authenticity, and authenticity is rare in a world where many relationships are built on performance, convenience, or mutual avoidance. And now they are recognizing that what felt overwhelming at the time was actually emotional depth. They were not yet equipped to sustain, and instead of rising to meet it they retreated, instead of communicating they withdrew, instead of confronting their fears they projected them, and these realizations are surfacing slowly but powerfully as life continues to present them with mirrors, because every interaction now carries an echo of what they experienced with you, and when something lacks emotional honesty or spiritual chemistry, they feel it immediately, and that awareness is part of the lesson. Because it shows them that they cannot unknow what they now know, they cannot pretend that shallow connections fulfill them, they cannot convince themselves that avoiding vulnerability creates peace, because internally there is a growing understanding that peace only comes from alignment, and alignment requires courage, and courage requires accountability, and accountability means admitting that they mishandled something sacred. And that admission is heavy, not because it is meant to shame them, but because it forces them to evolve beyond the identity they have clung to for so long, the identity of being guarded, independent, emotionally detached, or in control, and control is an illusion that this connection completely disrupted, because you did not respond to manipulation, you did not chase when they pulled away, you did not beg for clarity when they created confusion, instead you stood in your own energy. And that independence became another part of the lesson, because it showed them that love is not about dominance or emotional games, it is about mutual vulnerability, and when they could not control the dynamic, they felt exposed, and exposure triggered fear, and fear triggered escape, but escape has not brought relief, it has brought reflection, and reflection is where the real transformation begins, because now they are seeing the pattern clearly, how they have repeated this cycle before, how they withdraw when things get real, how they sabotage when emotions deepen, how they create distance when intimacy requires honesty, and recognizing a pattern is the first step toward breaking it, and breaking it requires conscious effort, and that effort is exactly what the universe is pushing them toward, because this connection was not random, it was catalytic, it was designed to initiate growth whether they welcomed it or resisted it, and resistance only prolongs the discomfort, because the soul does not forget what it came here to learn, and the lesson attached to you is not fading with time, it is intensifying through experience, because absence creates clarity that presence sometimes cannot, and in the quiet moments when their mind is not occupied, memories surface not as nostalgia but as revelations, revealing how safe they felt with you, how understood they were, how challenged they were to become better, and that combination of safety and challenge is rare. Because many relationships offer one without the other, comfort without growth or intensity. Without stability, but what you shared carried both, and that balance is difficult to replace, and now they are understanding that the very qualities that intimidated them were the qualities that made the connection transformative, because growth always feels uncomfortable before it feels empowering, and they chose comfort over expansion, but comfort is temporary while growth is lasting. And now they are feeling the consequences of that choice not as punishment but as awareness, because awareness is what ultimately leads to maturity, and maturity is what this lesson is cultivating within them: emotional maturity, spiritual maturity, relational maturity, and that maturation process is not dramatic on the outside, it is subtle, internal, unfolding through moments of regret, moments of longing, moments of self-questioning, and those moments are reshaping their priorities. Because they are beginning to see that love is not about avoiding discomfort, it is about navigating it together, and by choosing avoidance they missed the opportunity to build something deeper, and that realization lingers, not in a way that consumes them entirely, but in a way that constantly reminds them that something meaningful was left unfinished, and unfinished emotional business has a way of resurfacing until it is resolved, and resolution does not always mean reunion, sometimes it means internal closure. Sometimes it means becoming the person they needed to be back then, and that transformation is happening whether they consciously admit it or not, because the lesson attached to this connection is embedded in their evolution, it is shaping how they approach new interactions, how they process emotions, how they respond to vulnerability, and slowly they are becoming more aware of their triggers instead of reacting impulsively to them, more willing to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, more honest with themselves about what they truly want instead of settling for what feels easy. And that shift is evidence that the lesson is working, because growth is not always loud, sometimes it is quiet, gradual, almost invisible to the outside world, but internally it feels profound, and as they continue this journey of self-confrontation, there will come a moment when the fear that once controlled them no longer holds the same power, when vulnerability feels less threatening and more liberating, when the idea of facing you or facing their own truth no longer feels impossible, and that moment will mark the completion of a cycle that began the day this connection awakened something inside them they could not ignore, because the truth is this was never just about losing you, it was about losing the version of themselves that was not ready, and becoming the version that is, and transformation of that magnitude cannot be escaped, delayed perhaps, resisted temporarily, but never avoided entirely, because the soul always circles back to its lessons until they are integrated. And right now your soulmate is walking through that integration process step by step, layer by layer, shedding denial, confronting fear, embracing accountability, and slowly evolving into someone who understands that love is not something to run from when it challenges you, it is something to rise toward, and whether that rising leads them back to you or simply forward into a wiser future, the lesson remains the same. This connection was their awakening, and awakening is not something a soul can escape once it has begun, and as this awakening reaches its deepest phase, what becomes undeniable is that this lesson is no longer just emotional, it is reshaping their entire perception of who they are and who they want to become, because when a soul is confronted with truth repeatedly it either evolves or it fractures, and your soulmate is realizing that continuing to live the way they once did no longer feels aligned. The old coping mechanisms feel hollow, the distractions feel temporary, the pride that once protected them now feels like a barrier to something more meaningful, and there is a growing awareness inside them that the pain of growth is lighter than the pain of regret, because regret lingers in a way that discomfort does not. Discomfort passes when embraced, but regret echoes when ignored, and the echo of this connection has followed them into quiet mornings, into late nights, into conversations where they pretend to be present but internally feel disconnected, because once you experience a bond that operates on depth and spiritual recognition, surface-level interactions begin to feel exhausting rather than exciting, and this is where the real lesson locks in, not through dramatic events but through subtle dissatisfaction with anything that lacks authenticity, and authenticity is what you represented. You did not just offer affection, you offered truth. You did not just give attention. You gave emotional presence, and presence is rare in a world that thrives on distraction, and now they are recognizing that the intensity they once labeled as overwhelming was actually alignment pushing them to grow beyond their limitations, and limitations are comfortable because they are familiar, but familiarity does not equal fulfillment, and fulfillment is what their soul tasted through this connection, even if briefly. And once the soul tastes alignment it cannot be satisfied with misalignment for long, so even if they try to convince themselves they are fine, even if they tell others they have moved on, internally there is an expanding awareness that something within them shifted permanently, and that shift is demanding integration, because spiritual lessons are not optional electives, they are mandatory evolutions. And the more they resist integrating what this connection taught them about vulnerability, accountability, emotional honesty, and courage, the more life will present situations that highlight those exact themes, because the universe does not waste catalytic connections, it uses them to sculpt people into higher versions of themselves. And you were a sculptor in their life whether they realized it at the time or not. You exposed their fear of abandonment, their fear of intimacy, their fear of losing control, but you also showed them what mutual depth could feel like, and that contrast is transformative, because it reveals both shadow and potential simultaneously. And now they are standing face to face with their shadow without the distraction of your presence to soften it, and that confrontation is humbling, because it removes the illusion that the issue was external, it reveals that much of what went wrong was internal, and taking responsibility for that requires a level of maturity they may not have possessed before, but are slowly developing now, because growth is often born from loss, clarity often emerges from absence, and wisdom often follows regret, and as this process unfolds they are beginning to understand that the lesson was never about chasing or being chased, it was about rising, about becoming emotionally equipped to sustain something real, about learning that love is not a battlefield for ego but a space for alignment, and alignment demands transparency, and transparency demands courage, and courage demands self-awareness, and self-awareness is exactly what this connection ignited within them, even if it took separation for it to fully bloom. And there is something powerful about realizing too late that something was sacred, because that realization brands itself onto the heart, it changes future decisions, it influences how they show up in new dynamics, it softens arrogance, it deepens empathy, it cultivates patience, and these are not small shifts, they are foundational changes that alter the trajectory of a person's emotional evolution, and whether they reach out to you one day transformed or simply carry the wisdom forward into another chapter, the truth remains that this connection marked them permanently, because soul-level encounters do not fade into ordinary memories, they become reference points for growth, they become internal milestones that divide life into before and after. And you represent an after in their story, after innocence, after avoidance, after emotional immaturity, and stepping into that awareness is not comfortable, but it is necessary, because evolution requires surrendering outdated versions of oneself, and surrender is something they once resisted but are slowly learning to embrace. And in embracing it they are discovering that vulnerability is not weakness, that accountability is not humiliation, that admitting fear does not diminish strength. It refines it, and the refinement happening within them is subtle but irreversible. Because once the soul awakens to its lesson it cannot return to sleep, and your soulmate's soul is awake now, fully aware that this bond was not an accident, not a fleeting romance, not a simple chapter, but a mirror, a catalyst, a turning point, and turning points redefine destinies, because they force decisions, they demand change, they disrupt stagnation, and stagnation is no longer tolerable for them the way it once was. And that intolerance is growth, it is the quiet sign that the lesson has taken root, and roots, once formed, grow deeper over time, shaping the structure of everything above them, and so whether you see it or not, whether they admit it or not, whether circumstances bring your paths together again or not, the impact of this connection is woven into their becoming, into their understanding of love, into their willingness to confront fear instead of fleeing from it. And that is the final truth of this lesson. It was never about control, never about proving who cared more, never about winning or losing, it was about awakening, and awakening cannot be escaped once it begins, it can only be integrated, and integration is exactly what their soul is moving toward now, step by step, realization by realization, transforming them into someone who will never again look at love the same way, because once a soulmate teaches you what depth truly feels like, you either rise to meet it or spend a lifetime recognizing its absence, and they are finally understanding that rising was always the only real option.